Welcome, friend, to this quiet moment where we gently open the pages of the past. Tonight, our story takes us to a time very different from our own, yet still full of real, human lives and emotions. Whether you're winding down for the night or simply slowing your thoughts, I'm thankful to have you here. I'd love to know where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is for you. It's always special to see how history connects people across the world. And if gentle stories like this bring you comfort, I hope you'll consider subscribing. There are many more tales waiting to carry us into the calm of the night. Tonight, we walk the narrow, muddy streets of a medieval town, where the lives of street vendors were anything but easy. These were not the joyful market sellers you might see in stories or movies. They were often poor, struggling people, trying each day just to get enough food for their families. Their earnings were small, their future always uncertain, and they were often looked down upon, just one step above beggars in the eyes of society. Thomas is one of these vendors. He starts his day before the sun rises, just as he has for the past 15 years. His tiny bakery, if you could call it that, is part of the one-room home he shares with his wife Agnes and their 3 surviving children. 2 others were lost in early childhood, taken by illness and hunger. Sadly, a common story in those harsh times. The bread Thomas makes is dark and rough, made from rye, barley, and any other grains he can find. When money is especially tight, which it often is, he has to stretch his supplies by mixing in things that today would seem unthinkable. Crushed acorns, bits of sawdust, even chalk are sometimes added, not to cheat anyone, but simply so he can make enough loaves to sell and feed his own family. To make his flour last, Thomas adds whatever he can find to stretch the dough. These extras, acorns, sawdust, even chalk, are not meant to deceive, but to help him make more loaves. If he sells enough today, he might have just enough money to buy ingredients for tomorrow's batch. The streets he walks are far from safe or clean. There are no garbage collectors or sewers in his town. People throw their waste straight into the streets. Animals, pigs, chickens, and horses roam freely, leaving their droppings wherever they go. When the rain comes, as it often does in the damp lands of northern Europe, the streets turn into ankle-deep streams of mud and filth. Still, Thomas pushes forward, his arms full of bread and hope. Each day he must fight for customers. Dozens of other vendors line the roads, all shouting and calling out, trying to draw people to their goods. It's a loud, busy world, and sometimes a cruel one. Stronger sellers guard their favorite spots fiercely. Fights over space are common, and older or weaker vendors are often shoved aside, left to sell in quiet corners where few people pass. Thomas gets no real help from those in power. City officials see people like him as a problem, not as workers. They blame the street vendors for making the town messy and noisy. The rules about where he can stand, what he can sell, and what prices he can charge change often. Fines are handed out freely, not to keep order, but to take money from those who already have little. Unlike skilled tradesmen who belong to guilds, groups that protect their members, Thomas has no such support. Street vendors like him are on their own, with no safety net. Every day is a gamble. He relies on his own wits, his determination, and the kindness of the people who stop to buy his bread. Agnes, Thomas's wife, is very important to the family's survival. While Thomas sells bread in the streets, Agnes works in their small herb garden behind their home. She grows any vegetables that can live in the poor soil and cold weather. She also takes care of a few skinny chickens. But their eggs are too valuable to eat. Agnes sells them to help earn more money for the family. At night, Agnes sits by a candle and spins wool into thread. She sells the thread to cloth sellers to earn a few small coins. Their children also work, starting when they are very young. The oldest is a 10-year-old boy named Edmund. He helps his father carry bread through the streets and keeps watch in case thieves or mean sellers try to hurt them. The 2 younger girls help Agnes with the garden and chickens. They also gather small pieces of wood and dried animal dung to use as fuel for cooking and warmth. The children do not go to school. Learning to read and write is only for rich people and church workers. Thomas and Agnes cannot read or write. They make deals by talking and trusting others. They have no written contracts, so if someone lies or cheats them, there is little they can do. The seasons make life even harder. Summer brings longer days, which means more time to sell bread. But the heat makes bread spoil fast, so Thomas must sell it quickly. If it sits too long, it becomes useless. In winter, days are shorter, and the cold makes it painful to stand outside and sell. During harvest season, many farmers come to town to sell their food. This gives Thomas more people to sell to, but also brings more sellers, making the competition much harder. Thomas sometimes tries to buy grain directly from farmers because it can be a little cheaper. But this is not easy. He has to compete with big bakers and rich merchants who can afford to buy a lot more than he can. On religious festival days or special market days, many people come into town, giving Thomas a chance to sell more bread. Sometimes on these days, he makes enough money to feed his family well for several days. But this kind of success doesn't happen often, and Thomas can never count on it. Street vendors like Thomas always worry about thieves. Criminals might steal their bread or the coins they have earned during the day. Thomas has learned to hide his money in different spots in his clothes. He also changes the way he walks home so that no one can guess his routine. Still, in the last 5 years, he has been robbed 3 times. Each time, he lost all his money and all his bread, and his family went hungry for days. Disease is another danger. The streets in medieval towns are very dirty and full of waste, making it easy for sickness to spread. Thomas has lived through 2 terrible plague outbreaks that killed many people, including other sellers and customers. During times like these, people stay away from the markets, which means Thomas can't sell his bread. He also struggles to get good ingredients. Sellers often give poor quality grain to small buyers like him, and he doesn't have the power to demand better. Thomas tries to check the grain carefully before buying it, but sometimes the problems, like mold or spoilage, only appear after he has baked the bread. By then, it's too late to fix it, and he loses money. Keeping food fresh is also hard. Thomas doesn't have a proper place to store grain or baked bread, so everything must be sold quickly before it goes bad. Thomas's small home does not protect well against dampness, rats, or bugs. These pests can easily ruin his important baking supplies. He made simple wooden boxes to keep his flour and other goods safe, but they don't help much. Rats are a big problem. They eat his food and leave droppings and urine, making everything dirty and unsafe to use. The tools Thomas uses are very basic. He carries his bread on a wooden tray that he carved himself from a piece of driftwood he found near the river. He has a small knife that he keeps sharp with stones. He uses it to cut loaves for customers who can't afford to buy a whole one. He keeps the few coins he earns in a worn-out leather pouch. A rough piece of cloth covers his bread to protect it from the rain and dust. Weather is very important to Thomas's success. Rain keeps people inside and can ruin his bread before he sells it. Strong winds blow his bread and cloth around, making it hard to keep things in order. Snow and ice make the streets slippery and dangerous, and fewer people come out to buy. Even hot, sunny days are a problem because the bread gets dry and hard quickly. The people who buy bread from Thomas are often poor themselves. They try to pay less or get a better deal. They check the bread closely for signs that it's old or not made well. If they don't like what they see, they walk away, and Thomas loses that sale. He almost never gives credit because he knows that poor people may not be able to pay him back. Thomas also has to be very careful with rich customers. If someone with money comes to buy bread, he must take off his cap and speak politely, calling them by their proper title. In medieval society, everyone had a place, and it was important to show respect to those above you. If Thomas does not show proper respect to rich or powerful people, he can lose customers or even get into serious trouble. Some might complain to the town leaders, who could fine him or punish him in other ways. But at the same time, Thomas has to be strong enough to speak up and make sure he gets paid fairly for his bread. This balance is hard to manage. If Thomas has a problem with a customer or another vendor, the law is not much help. Rich people and those with high status are usually believed over poor workers like Thomas. Judges and town officials rarely side with someone like him. Even when Thomas knows he is right, he avoids going to court because it takes too much time and money and often makes things worse. Special holidays and festivals can be both good and bad for street sellers. These events bring many people to the town, which means more chances to sell bread. But they also bring more sellers from other places, which makes the market very crowded. On top of that, the town leaders often charge extra taxes and fees during these events. These costs take away from the small profits Thomas makes. Some religious days also have rules that stop people from working or selling, which means Thomas cannot do business at all on those days. Selling bread in the streets is hard on the body. Thomas walks for many hours every day, carrying his heavy bread tray through muddy streets and rough paths. His back always hurts from lifting sacks of flour and bending over to serve customers. His hands are rough, cracked, and stained from years of handling dough and working with simple tools. The weather has aged him quickly. Even though he is only 35 years old, he looks much older. At night, Thomas and his family do not sleep well. Their small house is cold and noisy. The walls do not keep out sounds from the street or bad smells from nearby waste and open drains. It is hard to rest, even after a long and tiring day. The straw that serves as their bedding is infested with fleas and other insects that make rest difficult. Worry about the next day's business keeps Thomas awake many nights as he mentally calculates how much bread he can afford to bake with his remaining ingredients and whether he will earn enough to purchase supplies for the following day. The social isolation experienced by street vendors adds another dimension to their hardship. Their low status in society means they have few friends or allies among the more established members of the community. Other vendors are competitors rather than companions, and customers view them with suspicion and often contempt. The clergy, while preaching charity and compassion, rarely extend genuine friendship or support to those they consider beneath their station. Despite all these challenges, Thomas continues his daily struggle because he has no viable alternatives. He lacks the capital to establish a proper bakery, the connections to join a guild, or the education to pursue other trades. Street vending, harsh as it is, represents his only means of survival in a world that offers few opportunities for social mobility. Each day he rises before dawn, lights his oven, and begins the process anew, driven by the basic human need to provide for his family and maintain some shred of dignity in an undignified world. The story of Thomas the Baker represents just one example of the countless street vendors who struggled to survive in medieval Europe. From fishmongers selling their catch in coastal towns to cloth merchants peddling their wares in mountain villages, these humble traders formed the backbone of medieval commerce while living lives of extraordinary hardship and uncertainty. Their struggles illuminate the harsh realities of daily life for the vast majority of people in an era that is often romanticized in popular culture, but was in reality brutally unforgiving for those at the bottom of society's hierarchy. Based on the reference materials provided, here's part 2 of the harsh lives of medieval street vendors. Yet the perils facing these street vendors extended far beyond the simple challenge of making a sale. Disease stalked the crowded marketplaces like an invisible predator, ready to claim the unwary. The very air they breathed was thick with pestilence. In the narrow winding streets where vendors hawked their wares, refuse piled in festering heaps between cobblestones. Human waste flowed openly through crude gutters, mingling with animal droppings and rotting food scraps to create a noxious soup that bred illness. Vendors like Margaret the fishmonger worked from dawn to dusk, surrounded by the stench of decay. Her modest stall, wedged between a blacksmith's forge and a tanner's workshop, reared a fish that had begun to turn in the summer heat. Without any means of refrigeration, Margaret fought a losing battle against time itself. The cod and herring she purchased at dawn would grow increasingly rank as the day wore on, their scales dulling and their flesh softening in the merciless sun. Each morning, Margaret would examine her remaining stock from the previous day, carefully trimming away the worst of the spoilage and arranging the least offensive specimens at the front of her display. The art of selling deteriorating fish required a delicate balance of honesty and survival. Too truthful about the quality, and she would starve. Too deceptive, and she risked the wrath of customers who might return seeking retribution for their ruined meals. The threat of contamination hung over every transaction. Flies swarmed the market stalls in black clouds, settling indiscriminately on food. Faces and festering wounds. Rats skewered boldly between the vendors' feet, growing fat on the endless supply of dropped morsels and spoiled goods. These creatures served as unwitting harbingers of the Black Death and countless other maladies that periodically swept through medieval cities like scythes through wheat. Street vendors found themselves particularly vulnerable to these outbreaks. Their work demanded constant contact with the public, handling coins that had passed through countless unwashed hands, breathing air thick with the exhalations of the masses. When plague struck a community, the marketplace often became ground zero for its spread. Vendors who survived such outbreaks frequently found their customer base decimated, their already precarious livelihoods hanging by an even thinner thread. The seasonal nature of their trade added another layer of uncertainty to their existence. William the fruit seller knew that his fortunes rose and fell with the rhythms of harvest and scarcity. Spring brought the promise of fresh produce, but also the lean months when winter stores had dwindled and new crops had yet to ripen. During these hungry times, William might find himself selling whizzed apples and sprouting onions to customers whose coin purses had grown as thin as their bodies. Summer offered abundance, but also fierce competition. When orchards burst with fruit and gardens overflowed with vegetables, the market became a battlefield where vendors undercut each other's prices in desperate attempts to move their perishable inventory. William watched helplessly as perfect pears rotted in his baskets, while customers haggled over pennies they could ill afford to spend. Autumn brought the harvest rush, a frenzied period when vendors worked themselves to exhaustion, processing, and preserving the year's bounty. This was when fortunes were made or lost, when a successful season might provide enough coin to weather the coming winter, or when disaster might spell starvation for an entire family. William spent these crucial months transforming fresh fruit into dried goods, trading immediate profit for the promise of sales during the barren months ahead. Winter was perhaps the cruelest season of all. With fresh produce a distant memory, vendors like William subsisted on selling preserved goods at inflated prices to customers who could barely afford them. The cold seeped through inadequate clothing, numbing fingers and making the simple act of counting coins an ordeal. Snow and ice made the already treacherous streets nearly impossible, reducing foot traffic to a trickle of the most desperate shoppers. The psychological toll of such an existence cannot be understated. These vendors lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing whether the next day would bring profit or loss, sustenance or starvation. Sleep came fitfully to those who spent their days balanced on the knife's edge of survival. Dreams were haunted by visions of empty stalls and angry customers, of debts unpaid and families unfed. Yet perhaps most crushing of all was the complete absence of any social safety net. When illness struck, when injury prevented work, when age finally bent the back beyond repair, there was nowhere to turn. The guilds that protected established craftsmen had no interest in the welfare of lowly street vendors. The church, while occasionally dispensing charity, could hardly feed the multitudes of destitute souls that crowded medieval cities. Family members often became economic units rather than sources of comfort. Children were pressed into service as soon as they could walk, tasked with running errands, minding stalls, or working as lookouts for approaching authorities. Wives bore the double burden of helping with the family trade while managing households on impossibly meager resources. The elderly, no longer able to contribute to the family's survival, became burdens that strained already overtaxed resources. The legal system offered no protection for these marginalized vendors. Courts were the province of the wealthy and well-connected, not the haunt of those who sold goods from push carts and makeshift stalls. Justice, when it existed at all, was swift and brutal. A vendor accused of cheating customers might find themselves in the stocks, their goods confiscated, and their reputation destroyed. The presumption of innocence was a luxury reserved for those who could afford legal representation. Even death offered no dignity to these forgotten souls. Street vendors who perished from disease, exhaustion, or violence were often buried in unmarked graves, their passing noted by none, save the family members left to continue the struggle for survival. Their life's work vanished without trace, their accumulated knowledge of trade and survival dying with them. The winter of 1347 proved particularly harsh for the vendors of London's markets. Robert the grain seller watched helplessly as his customers grew fewer with each passing day. The previous summer's harvest had been poor, and what grain remained commanded prices that placed it beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest citizens. Robert found himself in the impossible position of needing to eat his own inventory to survive, while simultaneously preserving it to generate the income necessary for survival. As the cold deepened and snow began to fall with increasing frequency, Robert noticed changes in his remaining customers that filled him with dread. They moved more slowly, their faces gaunt, and their eyes hollow with hunger. Some bore the telltale signs of scurvy, their gums bleeding, and their teeth loosening from malnutrition. Others showed the swollen limbs and distended bellies that marked them as victims of dropsy, their bodies retaining fluid in a desperate attempt to preserve life. But it was the children who broke Robert's heart most completely. Little ones who should have been playing and laughing. Instead, moved like ancient souls, their growth stunted by chronic hunger, and their eyes holding a weariness that belonged to no child. They clutched at their parents' hands with desperate intensity, as if sensing that their hold on life itself was equally tenuous. The arrival of spring brought no relief, only different forms of suffering. The first ships from foreign ports carried more than exotic goods in their holds. Rats skewered down mooring lines, their fleas heavy with a disease that would soon earn the name Black Death. Within weeks, the bustling marketplaces of medieval cities became channel houses where the living stepped carefully around the bodies of the dead. For those street vendors who survived the initial onslaught of plague, the world that emerged from that devastation was both opportunity and nightmare. With so many dead, competition for customers decreased dramatically. But the customers themselves had become a source of mortal terror. Every transaction carried the risk of contagion. Every coin potentially bore the touch of death. The social fabric of medieval society, already strained by centuries of inequality and hardship, began to unravel completely. Street vendors found themselves among the few willing to venture into plague-ravaged neighborhoods, delivering food and supplies to those too terrified or too ill to leave their homes. This essential service came at a horrific cost, as vendor after vendor succumbed to the very disease they had risked everything to combat. Those who survived did so through a combination of luck, isolation, and the kind of grim determination that had sustained their class through generations of hardship. They had learned to expect nothing from life, save what they could wrest from it through their own efforts. In a world where death could strike without warning and justice was a luxury beyond their means, medieval street vendors developed a resilience that bordered on the supernatural. Their legacy lives on not in grand monuments or written histories, but in the genetic memory of struggle that courses through the veins of all who work for daily bread. They remind us that prosperity is fragile, that security is often illusory, and that the distance between civilization and chaos can be measured in the span of a single failed harvest or the arrival of a single plague ship. In examining their lives, we see reflected not just the harsh realities of medieval existence, but the fundamental human capacity to endure, to hope, and to continue the essential work of living, even when that work offers little reward beyond the promise of another day's survival. Based on the reference materials provided, here's part 3 of the harsh lives of medieval street vendors. As dawn broke over the cramped quarters of medieval cities, a different kind of desperation stirred among those who had no fields to till or workshops to call their own. These were the street vendors, the most precarious of all medieval laborers, whose very survival depended on their ability to hawk whatever meager wares they could scrape together in the narrow, filth-strewn alleys of urban centers. Unlike the peasants bound to their lord's estate or the craftsmen protected by their guilds, street vendors existed in a twilight world of commerce, operating without the safety nets that others, however meager, might enjoy. They were the economic outcasts, the desperate souls who turned to the streets when all other avenues had closed, carrying their entire livelihood in a wooden tray, a cloth bundle, or a rickety cart that might collapse at any moment. Consider the plight of Margot, a widow whose husband had perished in one of the endless wars that plagued the countryside. With no land to inherit and no male relatives to provide for her, she found herself cast into the unforgiving world of street commerce. Each morning she would rise before the cathedral bells rang for matins, gathering whatever scraps she could afford to purchase from the wholesale merchants who controlled the city's food supply. A few turnips past their prime, perhaps some barley that had been rejected by the bakers, or if fortune smiled upon her, a handful of eggs from chickens too old to lay regularly. The mathematics of street vending were brutally simple and utterly unforgiving. Margot might spend her last few copper coins purchasing goods at dawn, only to discover that 3 other vendors had secured the same items and were selling them at the same busy intersection. Competition was not merely fierce, it was existential. Every customer who chose her rival's turnips over hers meant another step closer to starvation. The locations where vendors could ply their trade were severely limited and jealously guarded. The prime spots near the cathedral doors, the market squares, and the gates where travelers entered the city were controlled by established merchants who paid fees to the city authorities for the privilege. Street vendors were relegated to the margins, quite literally, forced to hawk their wares in the shadowy spaces between legitimate commerce. They clustered in the narrow alleyways beneath the overhanging upper stories of houses or in the muddy areas near the city walls, where the smell from the latrines was so overwhelming that even the poor avoided lingering. These marginal locations came with their own perils. The spaces between buildings were often the domain of cutthroats and thieves who viewed the vendors as easy targets. A street vendor carrying the day's earnings, however modest, might find themselves set upon by desperate souls even more destitute than themselves. The city watch, such as it was, rarely ventured into these shadowy corners, and when they did, it was often to shake down the vendors themselves for bribes rather than to provide protection. The goods that street vendors sold told the story of medieval urban poverty in miniature. They offered the scraps and leftovers that the established merchants couldn't or wouldn't sell. Bread that had hardened beyond palatability might be hawked as trencher bread for those too poor to afford fresh loaves. Vegetables that were beginning to rot could be sold to desperate customers who would cut away the spoiled portions and make do with what remained. Sometimes vendors would purchase the intestines, feet, and organs that butchers discarded, boiling them into a thin soup that could be sold to laborers who had no time or means to prepare their own meals. The seasonal nature of medieval commerce meant that street vendors faced periods of absolute destitution. During the harsh winter months, when fresh produce disappeared entirely and the city's population huddled indoors, vendors might go days without making a single sale. Unlike the peasants who could at least retreat to their hovels and subsist on stored grain, or the craftsmen who could work by firelight in their workshops, street vendors had no shelter from the economic storms that periodically swept through medieval cities. Many vendors supplemented their meager income through activities that existed in the gray areas between legal commerce and outright crime. They might serve as unofficial messengers, carrying news and gossip between different quarters of the city for a few copper coins. Some acted as procurers, helping travelers find lodging or services, taking a small cut from any transactions they facilitated. Others ventured into the countryside surrounding the city, gathering wild herbs, mushrooms, or berries that they could sell to urban dwellers who had no access to such things. The relationship between street vendors and the established merchant class was one of barely concealed hostility. Guild merchants viewed the vendors as unfair competition who undercut their prices and diluted the value of their carefully controlled trades. They lobbied city authorities constantly to crack down on street vending, arguing that unlicensed sellers were a threat to public health and civic order. These efforts often succeeded, resulting in periodic sweeps where city officials would confiscate vendors' goods and impose fines that could devastate families already living on the edge of survival. Yet, despite their official disapproval, even guild merchants found uses for the street vendor network. When a merchant had goods that were slightly damaged or past their prime, selling them through street vendors allowed them to recoup some value without damaging their own reputation. This created a complex web of interdependence where vendors served as an unofficial outlet for the waste and overflow of the legitimate economy, while being simultaneously persecuted by those same legitimate businesses. The health hazards faced by street vendors were extraordinary, even by medieval standards. Spending long hours in the open air exposed them to every weather extreme, from the scorching heat of summer to the bitter cold of winter. The goods they handled were often of questionable quality to begin with, and the primitive preservation methods of the era meant that vendors were constantly exposed to spoiled food and contaminated water. Many developed chronic illnesses from their constant exposure to the elements and poor quality provisions. The social isolation of street vendors was perhaps as devastating as their economic precarity. Unlike peasants who lived in small communities where everyone knew their neighbors, or craftsmen who belonged to guilds that provided both professional identity and social connection, street vendors existed on the margins of urban society. They were too poor to participate in the religious festivals and celebrations that bound communities together, too transient to form lasting relationships, and too desperate to trust even their fellow vendors, who were, after all, direct competitors for the same limited pool of customers. Children born into families of street vendors faced particularly grim prospects. From the moment they could walk, they were pressed into service, helping their parents hawk goods, standing for hours in all weather, holding baskets or calling out to potential customers. Education was utterly beyond their reach, not merely because their families couldn't afford it, but because every moment spent learning letters or numbers was a moment not spent earning the coins that meant the difference between eating and starving. These children learned early that survival meant being constantly alert to opportunity and danger. They developed an acute sense of reading people's faces and moods, knowing instantly which potential customers might have coins to spend and which were likely to drive them away with curses or blows. Many became accomplished pickpockets and petty thieves, skills that their parents tacitly encouraged even as they officially disapproved. Knowing that sometimes theft was the only thing standing between their family and starvation, the legal status of street vendors was precarious. In the extreme, they operated without licenses or official sanction, which meant they had no recourse when customers cheated them or when other vendors stole their goods. City courts, when they functioned at all, were designed to serve the interests of established merchants and property owners. A street vendor who brought a complaint against a guild merchant or a member of the nobility would likely find themselves facing countercharges of vagrancy or disturbing the peace. This legal vulnerability made vendors easy targets for corruption and extortion. City officials, both legitimate and corrupt, regularly demanded bribes in exchange for the right to operate in certain areas or during certain times. These unofficial taxes further eroded the vendors' already razor-thin profit margins, but refusing to pay often meant being driven away from the best-selling locations or having one's goods confiscated on trumped-up charges. The religious life of street vendors reflected their marginal social status. While the medieval church preached charity and care for the poor, in practice, vendors found themselves excluded from much of the spiritual community. They couldn't afford the donations expected at religious services, couldn't spare the time for lengthy masses when every hour away from selling meant lost income, and often felt unwelcome in churches where the established merchants and craftsmen made their disapproval known. Yet faith remained important to many vendors, perhaps because it offered one of the few sources of hope in their otherwise bleak existence. They developed their own informal religious practices, saying quick prayers over their goods in the hope of attracting customers, crossing themselves when they made a sale, and invoking various saints who were believed to protect merchants and traders. Some carried small religious tokens or amulets, believing these would bring them luck or protect them from the many dangers of street life. The cycles of feast and famine that marked medieval life hit street vendors with particular severity. During religious festivals or market days, when the city filled with visitors and pilgrims, vendors might experience brief periods of relative prosperity as demand for their goods increased. But these peak times were followed inevitably by long stretches of minimal sales, and vendors had to carefully manage their earnings to survive the lean periods. The feast days presented their own challenges, however. The increased competition from temporary vendors who flooded the city during festivals meant that regular street vendors often found themselves pushed out of their usual selling spots by newcomers who had more capital or better connections. The irony was bitter. The very occasions that should have brought prosperity instead often brought increased hardship as the market became oversaturated with sellers competing for customers' limited coins. Weather was another constant enemy of the street vendor. Rain could ruin perishable goods in minutes, while extreme heat could spoil food before it could be sold. Snow and ice made the already treacherous city streets nearly impossible, while driving wind could scatter lightweight goods or extinguish the small fires that vendors used to cook prepared foods. Unlike merchants with permanent shops, vendors had no shelter for themselves or their wares, making them completely vulnerable to the whims of nature. The tools of the street vendor's trade were as humble as they were essential. A wooden tray or basket, perhaps a small cart if they were fortunate enough to afford one, a few pieces of cloth to display goods or protect them from the elements, and a leather pouch to hold the precious few coins that represented their entire fortune. These simple implements represented major investments for people living in such poverty, and their loss or destruction could spell complete disaster. Many vendors were forced to rent even these basic tools, paying daily fees to more prosperous individuals who had accumulated enough capital to invest in such equipment. This arrangement trapped vendors in a cycle of debt and dependency, where much of their daily earnings went to tool rental, leaving them unable to accumulate the capital needed to purchase their own equipment and escape the trap. The network of relationships that sustained street vendors was complex and fragile. Vendors often formed loose alliances with others who sold complementary goods, sharing information about where customers might be found or which areas to avoid due to increased enforcement activity. But these relationships were always strained by the reality that ultimately every vendor was competing with every other vendor for the same limited pool of customers. Some vendors specialized in serving particular communities within the city. Those who could speak multiple languages might focus on selling to foreign merchants or pilgrims, while others developed expertise in the specific needs of certain neighborhoods or professional groups. This specialization could provide some protection from competition, but it also made vendors vulnerable to changes in their chosen market segment. The evening hours brought their own particular challenges for street vendors. As darkness fell and the legitimate businesses closed their doors, the streets became increasingly dangerous. Vendors who hadn't sold their perishable goods during the day faced the agonizing choice of trying to sell them at drastically reduced prices in the growing darkness or accepting a total loss. Many vendors spent their evenings going door to door in the poorer neighborhoods, hoping to find customers who might purchase day-old bread or slightly spoiled produce at reduced prices. The constant stress of this precarious existence took a severe toll on the physical and mental health of street vendors. The combination of poor nutrition, exposure to the elements, and the relentless anxiety of never knowing where the next meal would come from created a population that aged rapidly and died young. Many vendors developed chronic coughs from breathing the polluted air of medieval cities, while others suffered from malnutrition-related diseases that sapped their strength and clouded their judgment. Yet despite all these hardships, the street vendors served a crucial function in the medieval urban economy. They provided a distribution network for goods that might otherwise go to waste. They served customers who couldn't afford the prices charged by established merchants, and they offered a form of economic activity for those who had been excluded from the formal structures of medieval commerce. In their own way, they were pioneers of what we might now call the informal economy, creating value and serving needs through sheer determination and ingenuity. The stories of individual vendors, when they survive in historical records at all, reveal both the crushing poverty and the remarkable resilience of these forgotten merchants. They speak of women who raised children while balancing baskets of goods on their heads, of men who walked miles each day to find customers for their wares, of families who shared single rooms with their inventory and counted each copper coin as if it were gold. As the medieval period drew to a close and new forms of commerce began to emerge, the street vendors found themselves facing new challenges and opportunities. The growth of towns and the increasing sophistication of trade networks created new markets for their services, but also brought increased regulation and competition. Some vendors managed to accumulate enough capital to establish permanent shops or join guilds, while others found themselves pushed even further to the margins as the formal economy expanded and consolidated. The legacy of medieval street vendors lives on in the informal markets and street commerce that continue to flourish in cities around the world. Their story reminds us that throughout history, there have always been those who survived by their wits and determination, creating livelihoods from nothing more than the courage to stand in the street and offer their wares to passers-by. In their struggles and their small triumphs, we see reflected the eternal human drive to survive and prosper, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Looking at your summary and the reference materials, I'll continue the script from where Part 3 left off. Here's Part 4. The relentless cycle of labor and scarcity that defined medieval street vendor life was further complicated by the constant threat of violence and theft that lurked in every shadowed alleyway and crowded marketplace. Unlike the organized merchants who enjoyed the protection of guilds and the security of established shops, street vendors were perpetually vulnerable, carrying their entire livelihood in baskets and carts that could be overturned or ransacked in an instant. Consider the plight of Agnes, a fishmonger who rose each morning before dawn to purchase her wares from the boats returning to harbor. With barely enough coin to buy a day's worth of fish, she had no choice but to extend credit from the fishermen, promising payment at day's end when her sales were complete. This precarious arrangement left her doubly vulnerable. If thieves made off with her basket, or if the fish spoiled in the heat before she could sell them, Agnes faced not only the loss of her day's income, but also mounting debts that could spiral beyond her ability to repay. The medieval streets offered little protection for such vulnerable merchants. City guards, when they existed at all, were primarily concerned with protecting the interests of established merchants and maintaining order around major market squares. The narrow winding lanes where street vendors often conducted their trade were largely lawless territories where might made right. Gangs of youths, desperate beggars, and petty criminals knew that a lone vendor with a cart full of goods presented an easy target. Violence against street vendors took many forms, from the swift grab-and-run theft of a few items to more organized raids that could destroy a vendor's entire stock. Some criminals specialized in targeting specific types of vendors. Bread sellers, for instance, were often robbed not just for the value of their goods, but because bread was immediately consumable and could feed a hungry thief or be quickly resold. Vendors selling small, valuable items like spices or metalwork faced constant threats from pickpockets and cut purses who could slip valuable merchandise into their clothes and disappear into the crowd. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was enormous. Street vendors developed an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, constantly scanning the crowd for potential threats while simultaneously trying to attract customers. They learned to read the subtle signs that might indicate trouble brewing, the way certain individuals moved through the crowd, the positioning of groups that might be planning a coordinated theft, the times of day when criminal activity was most likely to occur. Many vendors developed elaborate strategies to protect themselves and their goods. Some would form informal partnerships, watching each other's stalls during brief absences and creating networks of mutual protection. Others invested in guard dogs, though feeding an animal was yet another expense that strained their meager resources. The more successful vendors might hire a young apprentice or family member to serve as both helper and protector, though this too represented a significant financial burden. The seasonal nature of much street vending created additional security challenges. During busy market days or religious festivals, when the potential for sales was highest, the crowds also provided better cover for thieves and pickpockets. Vendors found themselves caught in a terrible dilemma. The very conditions that offered the best opportunity for profit also exposed them to the greatest risk of robbery and violence. Women vendors faced particular dangers as they were often seen as easier targets for both theft and assault. Female street sellers developed their own protective strategies, often dressing in ways that concealed their gender or traveling in groups for safety. Some carried hidden weapons, small knives, or sharpened tools that could serve double duty as implements of their trade and means of self-defense. The legal system offered little recourse for victims of street crime. Even when thieves were caught, the lengthy and expensive process of bringing them to justice was often beyond the means of a struggling street vendor. Courts typically favored established merchants and guild members over itinerant sellers, and the testimony of a lowly street vendor carried little weight against that of a respectable citizen. This constant threat of violence created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust that permeated every aspect of street vendor life. Vendors were suspicious not only of obvious threats, but also of potential customers who might be casing their goods for later theft. The need to remain constantly alert and defensive inevitably affected their ability to be friendly and welcoming to legitimate buyers, creating a vicious cycle that could harm their business prospects. The economic impact of crime against street vendors extended far beyond the immediate loss of goods. A single major theft could wipe out weeks or months of accumulated profit, forcing vendors to borrow money at usurious rates or sell family possessions to restock their inventory. Some vendors were driven out of business entirely by a succession of thefts, joining the ranks of the unemployed poor who themselves might turn to crime to survive. Weather presented another constant adversary for medieval street vendors, one that was as predictable as it was devastating. Unlike modern merchants who conduct business in climate-controlled environments, street vendors were entirely at the mercy of the elements, watching helplessly as rain, snow, wind, and extreme temperatures destroyed their goods and drove away their customers. Rain was perhaps the most immediate and frequent threat. A sudden downpour could ruin a day's worth of bread, dissolve carefully prepared foods, and damage textiles beyond repair. Vendors who sold paper goods, prepared foods, or anything that could be damaged by moisture lived in constant fear of the changing sky. Many developed elaborate systems of coverings and shelters, but these were often inadequate against a truly severe storm. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created periods of abundance and scarcity that street vendors had to navigate with skill and foresight. Summer brought the possibility of fresh produce and increased foot traffic, but also the challenge of keeping perishable goods from spoiling in the heat. Winter offered relief from spoilage, but brought new challenges as frozen goods became unsellable and potential customers remained huddled indoors. Snow and ice created treacherous conditions that made it difficult for vendors to transport their goods and dangerous for customers to venture out to make purchases. The narrow, unpaved streets of medieval towns became muddy quagmires in wet weather and frozen obstacles in winter, making the already difficult task of moving heavy carts and baskets nearly impossible. Extreme heat posed particular challenges for vendors selling food items. Without refrigeration, meat, dairy products, and prepared foods could spoil within hours during hot summer days. Vendors learned to time their purchases and sales carefully, buying only what they could sell before spoilage set in. But this limited their ability to take advantage of bulk purchasing discounts or to build up inventory during slow periods. Wind could be equally destructive, overturning carefully arranged displays, scattering lightweight goods, and making it impossible to maintain the neat, attractive presentations that helped draw customers. Vendors selling cloth or lightweight items lived in constant fear of sudden gusts that could send their entire inventory flying through the streets. The lack of adequate shelter in most medieval towns meant that street vendors had few options when severe weather struck. Some larger markets had covered areas, but these prime spots were typically reserved for established merchants who paid higher fees. Street vendors were left to create their own makeshift shelters using whatever materials they could afford, scraps of cloth, pieces of wood, or animal hides that provided minimal protection against the elements. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval street vendors displayed remarkable ingenuity and resilience in their daily struggle for survival. They developed intricate knowledge of their local markets, learning which corners offered the best protection from wind, which times of day brought the most customers, and which products were most likely to sell in different weather conditions. Many vendors specialized in goods that were less susceptible to weather damage or spoilage, even if these items offered lower profit margins. Others learned to diversify their offerings, carrying a mix of products that could provide income regardless of conditions. Some developed relationships with indoor merchants, serving as informal suppliers who could provide goods during times when the established shops were closed or understocked. The social networks that street vendors created among themselves became crucial survival mechanisms. Information about profitable locations, dangerous areas, reliable suppliers, and changing market conditions flowed through these informal networks, helping individual vendors make better decisions about where to go, what to sell, and when to cut their losses, and try again another day. These men and women, carrying their modest wares through the unpredictable streets of medieval towns, embodied a particular kind of courage, born from desperation and sustained by hope. They faced each day knowing that their livelihood hung by the thinnest of threads, that a single stroke of bad luck could plunge them into destitution. Yet they persisted in their efforts to carve out a place for themselves in an unforgiving economic system. Their stories remind us that behind the grand narratives of medieval history, the wars and conquests, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the great works of art and architecture, lay the quiet struggles of ordinary people trying to make a living in circumstances that would challenge the strongest among us. In their persistence and adaptability, we see reflected the fundamental human drive to survive and thrive even when the odds seem insurmountable. The Harsh Lives of Medieval Street Vendors, Part 5. As we delve deeper into the brutal realities of medieval commerce, we encounter perhaps the most vulnerable participants in this unforgiving economic landscape, the street vendors. These desperate souls represented the absolute bottom rung of medieval society's commercial hierarchy, existing in a precarious twilight between legitimate trade and outright destitution. Their stories illuminate the harsh truths of survival in an age where a single bad day could mean the difference between meager sustenance and starvation. The typical medieval street vendor possessed nothing more than what they could carry on their back or pile onto a rickety handcart. Unlike established merchants with their guild protections and permanent storefronts, these wandering traders operated entirely outside the formal economic structures that provided even minimal security to their more fortunate counterparts. They were the economic untouchables, scraping together whatever coins they could by selling society's unwanted remnants to those who could afford nothing better. Picture, if you will, the dawn breaking over a typical medieval town. As the church bells toll the morning hour, a hunched figure emerges from whatever shelter they managed to secure for the night. Perhaps a doorway, a stable, or if they were fortunate, a corner of an inn's common room purchased with their last remaining copper. This is Margot, a widow whose husband's death left her with nothing but debts and a fierce determination to survive. Her weathered hands clutch a woven basket containing her entire inventory, a few withered apples rescued from a merchant's refuge pile, some questionable strips of dried meat of uncertain origin, and several small clay vessels filled with what she optimistically calls healing salve, but which is little more than rendered animal fat mixed with common herbs. Margot's story exemplifies the desperate circumstances that drove people into street vending: the death of a breadwinner, the failure of a small business, exile from a guild, or simply being born into the wrong family could all lead to this hand-to-mouth existence. For women like Margot, widowhood was often a direct path to destitution. Medieval society offered few legitimate opportunities for women to earn a living independently, and those that existed were typically controlled by male-dominated guilds that jealously guarded their privileges. The merchandise these vendors offered tells its own story of desperation and resourcefulness. Fresh goods were far beyond their reach. Those went to established merchants with the capital to purchase quality inventory and the storage facilities to preserve it. Instead, street vendors dealt in the dregs of medieval commerce. They sold the bruised fruit that proper merchants discarded, the day-old bread that bakers couldn't move, the questionable cuts of meat that butchers couldn't guarantee. They peddled homemade remedies of dubious efficacy, crude trinkets fashioned from scraps of metal or wood, and whatever small services they could provide with their own two hands. The quality of these goods was often as questionable as their origins. Without proper storage or preservation methods, much of what street vendors offered was in various stages of decay. Fruit might be soft and beginning to rot. Bread could be hard as stone or growing mold, and meat was frequently rancid or crawling with maggots. Yet desperate customers driven by their own poverty would still purchase these inferior goods because they represented the only options within their meager budgets. Competition among street vendors was fierce and often brutal. Since they operated outside the regulated guild system, there were no established territories or agreed-upon practices. Vendors would fight viciously over the most promising locations, near church entrances where the faithful gathered, outside taverns where coins might flow more freely, or at the edges of established markets where they could catch the overflow of customers. These confrontations could turn violent quickly, with vendors using whatever weapons they could find to defend their precarious claims to a profitable spot. The relationship between street vendors and established merchants was one of constant tension and mutual suspicion. Guild merchants viewed these unlicensed traders as threats to their monopolies and profits. They complained to authorities that street vendors undercut their prices unfairly, sold inferior goods that damaged the reputation of all merchants, and attracted undesirable elements to commercial districts. Many established merchants would go to great lengths to drive street vendors away from areas they considered their territory, sometimes resorting to hiring thugs to intimidate or assault them. Local authorities generally shared the established merchants' antipathy toward street vendors. These unofficial traders paid no taxes, held no licenses, and contributed nothing to the formal economic structures that towns depended upon. They were seen as parasites, feeding off the legitimate commerce of proper citizens. Town guards would regularly harass street vendors, confiscating their goods on spurious charges, demanding bribes for the privilege of conducting business, or simply driving them away with threats of violence. The seasonal nature of medieval life hit street vendors particularly hard. During harsh winters, when travel was difficult and people had little money to spare, the already thin stream of potential customers dwindled to almost nothing. Vendors would huddle in whatever shelter they could find, slowly consuming their remaining inventory just to survive until spring brought the possibility of renewed trade. Many didn't make it through these lean months, succumbing to cold, hunger, or disease in anonymous deaths that went unrecorded, and unmise was a constant specter haunting the lives of street vendors. Their poor nutrition, exposure to the elements, and constant contact with contaminated goods made them prime targets for the various ailments that swept through medieval communities. A vendor who fell ill faced an impossible choice: continue working while sick and risk spreading disease to customers who might then refuse to buy from them, or rest and recover while their already meager income disappeared entirely. Most chose to continue working, creating a cycle where illness spread through the vendor community and then to their customers. The social isolation experienced by street vendors was perhaps as crushing as their physical hardships. Proper society viewed them with suspicion and contempt, seeing them as little better than beggars or criminals. They were excluded from religious services in better churches, denied entry to respectable establishments, and treated as pariahs by those only slightly higher on the social ladder. This isolation was particularly cruel because many vendors had once been part of respectable society before circumstances beyond their control drove them to the streets. Yet within this community of outcasts, bonds of solidarity sometimes formed. Vendors would share information about promising locations, warn each other about hostile authorities, and occasionally pull resources to help a colleague through a particularly difficult period. These informal networks provided the only social safety net available to people who had fallen through every other crack in medieval society. The inventory management challenges faced by street vendors were unlike anything experienced by established merchants. With no permanent storage and minimal capital, they had to carefully balance their purchases to ensure they could sell everything before it spoiled completely. A vendor might spend their last few coins on a batch of questionable fish, knowing they had only hours to sell it before it became completely inedible. The stress of these constant calculations, combined with the physical demands of hauling goods through crowded streets, took a severe toll on both body and mind. Children born into vendor families faced particularly grim prospects. From the moment they could walk, they were pressed into service as unpaid labor, helping to carry goods, watch for authorities, and attract customers with their innocent faces. Poor children in medieval cities had no chance to go to school. They also had no way to learn a skilled job through an apprenticeship. From a very young age, they were thrown into street life. They had to learn how to survive by selling small goods or helping their families with street trade. These children quickly learned how to read people, avoid trouble, and sometimes bend the rules just to stay alive. There were no honest paths to a better life for them, only hard choices. The relationship between street sellers and their customers was often tense. Buyers knew the goods were usually poor quality, but they didn't have many other options. They would carefully check each item, argue about the price, and try to pay as little as possible, even when the seller was already barely making a profit. There was very little trust on either side. Customers thought sellers were trying to trick them. Sellers knew that if someone found a better deal elsewhere, they would leave without a second thought. Getting paid was also hard. Many people had no coins at all. Instead, they offered to trade other things like old clothes, bits of food, or small services. A vendor might give away some spoiled fruit in exchange for a torn piece of cloth, hoping to trade that cloth later with someone else. But this kind of barter often left sellers stuck with items they couldn't use or sell. Street vendors had no clear rights under the law. Technically, they weren't doing anything illegal, but town leaders could change the rules at any time. A vendor might sell goods without trouble for many days, then suddenly get arrested for causing a disturbance or loitering. There were no rules to protect them if they were cheated, robbed, or attacked, whether by customers, other sellers, or even the guards themselves. Weather was another enemy that vendors had to fight every day. Rain could ruin anything a street vendor was selling if it wasn't well protected. Hot weather made food spoil faster and kept people off the streets. Snow and ice made it hard to move around and kept customers at home. Vendors always had to change their plans based on the weather. Sometimes they had to leave a good selling spot just because the weather was too bad to stay. Living like this was very hard on the mind and spirit. Not knowing how much money you would make, being looked down on by others, and doing hard physical work every day made people feel hopeless. Some street vendors began drinking alcohol or using other things to escape their sadness. This made it even harder for them to do their work. Many people may have taken their own lives, though back then such deaths were not written down or were blamed on other causes. Even with all these problems, some vendors found ways to keep going. They came up with clever tricks to make old or damaged goods seem useful. They learned how to talk to people and make quick sales, even with poor quality items. Some formed friendships and trading networks that helped them get through the hardest times. A few were lucky or smart enough to save money and start more stable businesses, but this was very rare and seen almost like a miracle. Religion was another difficult part of life for street vendors. In theory, the church taught that everyone was equal in God's eyes, but in real life, vendors were often left out. They couldn't give donations like richer people, they worked odd hours and couldn't always go to church, and people looked down on them because of the goods they sold. Many churchgoers didn't want vendors in their churches at all. Many street vendors created their own mix of religious beliefs. They combined Christian ideas with old superstitions, hoping these practices would keep them safe during their dangerous daily work. These beliefs gave them comfort, even if the church didn't always accept them. When we look closely at the hard lives of medieval street vendors, we can see how unfair the world was for poor people at that time. These vendors were not criminals or lazy people trying to get rich without effort. They were trapped in very difficult situations. They had no good choices and no real way to escape poverty. Every sale they made came from hours of struggle, pain, and the hope for just enough money to survive another day. Their stories remind us that trade and business in the Middle Ages wasn't only about kings, merchants, or big markets. It was also shaped by poor people who used every bit of creativity and strength they had to stay alive. These forgotten traders lived hard lives, but they showed great bravery. Even when everything seemed against them, they kept going. They show us that the human spirit can survive even in the hardest times. The Harsh Lives of Medieval Street Vendors, Part 6. As the early morning mist cleared from the stone streets, it revealed puddles of waste and garbage left from the day before. The street vendors began their daily struggle. They came out of tiny, crowded homes where whole families slept on piles of straw. Rats and fleas shared their living spaces, spreading disease from one home to another. The vendors' faces looked tired and worn. Their skin was rough from years of waking up early and working outside in every kind of weather. Their hands reached quickly for whatever goods they had to sell: small bundles of herbs, pieces of bread, old clothes, anything they could carry and trade before the heat of the day made people go back inside. The places where medieval street vendors worked were extremely dirty, even by the standards of the time. Open sewers ran down the middle of the streets, carrying human waste, animal remains, and old rotten food past the same spots where vendors sold their goods. The smell was terrible, a mix of decay and filth that soaked into people's clothes and skin. But for vendors, this was normal. They were used to it because they had no other choice. In those days, people didn't understand germs, and there were no public health rules to protect them. Water, which everyone needs to live, was often unsafe to use. The same rivers and wells that gave people water were also full of waste and garbage. Vendors had to use this dirty water to clean their food, their hands, and their tools. Without knowing it, they helped spread sickness every time they touched something or served a customer. Many vendors suffered from stomach problems, skin rashes, or breathing troubles, but they didn't know why they were always sick. Even the food they sold could make people ill. Meat left out in the open quickly drew flies, which had just come from piles of waste or dead animals. Vegetables and grains soaked up the bad air and spoiled quickly. Milk and cheese turned sour in just a few hours during the summer. Still, vendors had to try to sell their goods before they went completely bad, or they would lose all their money. Most vendors didn't have strong boxes or clean places to store food. They used rough wooden crates or simple baskets to carry everything. This made it easy for dirt, bugs, and disease to get into the food. It was a hard and dangerous way to make a living, but it was the only way many people could survive. Containers that offered little defense against rain, dust, or vermin. Rats and mice considered vendor stalls their personal feeding grounds, contaminating far more food than they actually consumed. A single rat could destroy a vendor's entire day's inventory by urinating on produce or gnawing through containers. Yet vendors had no effective means of pest control beyond crude traps and the occasional cat. Personal hygiene among vendors was virtually non-existent, not through choice, but through circumstance. Most vendors owned only one set of clothing, which they wore continuously until it literally fell apart. These garments became repositories of grease, food particles, sweat, and grime, creating perfect environments for lice and other parasites. Bathing was a luxury that few could afford, both in terms of time and resources. Even if vendors could spare the hours needed to heat water and find privacy, soap was expensive and often unavailable to those at the bottom of the economic ladder. The communal nature of medieval sanitation affected vendors particularly severely. Public latrines, where they existed at all, were shared by hundreds of people and rarely cleaned. More commonly, people simply relieved themselves in alleys, against walls, or directly in the streets. Vendors who spent their entire days in public spaces had little choice but to conduct their most private business in full view of potential customers, adding humiliation to the long list of indignities they endured daily. Disease spread through vendor communities with terrifying speed and efficiency. When one vendor fell ill with dysentery, typhoid, or any of the numerous ailments that thrived in these conditions, their close proximity to others in the marketplace ensured rapid transmission. Vendors who were sick had no option to stay home and recover. Missing even a single day of sales could mean starvation for their families. So they continued to work while ill, coughing and sneezing over their goods, touching their wares with hands that trembled from fever, spreading sickness to customers and fellow vendors alike. The periodic outbreaks of more serious diseases, such as the bubonic plague, devastated vendor communities with particular brutality. The Black Death, which swept through Europe repeatedly during the medieval period, found ideal conditions in the crowded, filthy marketplaces where vendors congregated. The disease was carried by fleas that lived on the rats infesting every corner of medieval towns, and vendors who worked at ground level, surrounded by refuse standing water, were among the most vulnerable populations. Entire families of vendors were wiped out in a matter of days, their stalls abandoned and their goods left to rot in the streets. Women vendors faced additional health challenges related to their gender. Pregnancy and childbirth in these unsanitary conditions were extremely dangerous, with maternal and infant mortality rates reaching horrific levels. Female vendors often gave birth in the same spaces where they sold food, assisted only by other women with no medical training. Postnatal infections were common and frequently fatal, leaving newborns, orphaned, and older children to fend for themselves in an already hostile environment. The water used for cooking and food preparation was a constant source of contamination. Vendors who sold prepared foods had no choice but to use whatever water was available, regardless of its quality. Stews and porrides were prepared with water that had already sickened countless people, while bread was kneaded with hands that had never been properly washed. The very act of preparing food for sale became a means of spreading disease throughout the community. Medical care for vendors was essentially non-existent. Physicians served only the wealthy, while barber surgeons, with their crude understanding of anatomy and medicine, were beyond the financial reach of most vendors. When vendors fell seriously ill, they relied on folk remedies passed down through generations, treatments that were often ineffective and sometimes actively harmful. Many vendors attempted to treat serious infections with picuses made from moldy bread or animal dung, unknowingly introducing additional pathogens into their wounds. The psychological toll of living in such conditions was immense, though rarely acknowledged or understood in medieval times. The constant fear of disease, the daily assault on the senses, from overwhelming odor and sights, and the knowledge that any day could bring a plague that would wipe out entire families, created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and despair. Vendors developed a fatalistic outlook, accepting sickness and early death as inevitable rather than preventable outcomes. Children born into vendor families faced particularly grim prospects. They were exposed to these appalling sanitary conditions from birth, their developing immune systems overwhelmed by constant assault from pathogens. Many died before reaching their first birthday. While those who survived often bore the permanent marks of malnutrition and disease, childhood illnesses that would be minor inconveniences today became death sentences in the medieval world. And parents learned not to become too attached to their youngest children, knowing that the odds of survival were poor. The seasonal nature of vendor work meant that sanitary conditions varied throughout the year, but never improved significantly. Summer brought heat that accelerated the decomposition of waste and food, creating even more intense odor and higher concentrations of disease-carrying insects. Winter provided some relief from flies and other pests, but vendors were forced to huddle closer together for warmth, facilitating the spread of respiratory illnesses and other contagious diseases. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval street vendors developed remarkable resilience and adaptation strategies. They learned to recognize the early signs of food spoilage and disease, becoming experts at assessing risks that they couldn't fully understand. They formed tight-knit communities that provided mutual support during times of illness, with healthy vendors caring for the children of sick colleagues and sharing resources when possible. These informal networks of care and cooperation were often the only thing standing between vendor families and complete destitution. The legacy of these harsh sanitary conditions extended far beyond the medieval period, shaping social attitudes toward poverty, disease, and urban planning for centuries to come. The association between the poor and disease became deeply embedded in social consciousness, leading to discrimination and marginalization that persisted long after the underlying causes were better understood. The street vendors of medieval times, struggling to survive in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable today, unknowingly helped to establish patterns of urban development and public health policy that would influence city planning for generations. In examining the sanitary conditions faced by medieval street vendors, we witness not just individual suffering, but a systematic failure of society to provide even the most basic protections for its most vulnerable members. These men, women, and children who risked their health daily to provide food and goods to their communities deserved better than the appalling conditions they endured. Their stories remind us of how far we have come in understanding public health and sanitation, while also serving as a sobering reminder of what life can become when basic human needs are ignored or deemed unimportant by those in power. Looking at your script so far and the reference materials, I'll continue from where you left off with Part 7. Here's the continuation, focusing on the daily survival struggles of medieval street vendors. The daily existence of medieval street vendors was punctuated by moments of desperate decision-making that would seem unthinkable to us today. When Agnes the fishmonger discovered that half her catch had spoiled overnight, she faced a choice that encapsulated the brutal reality of vendor life. She could discard the questionable fish and lose precious income her family desperately needed, or she could attempt to mask the spoilage with strong herbs and hope her customers wouldn't notice until after they'd paid. Agnes chose survival over honesty, as so many vendors did. She carefully arranged the fresher fish on top, buried the suspicious pieces beneath, and sprinkled everything liberally with dried rosemary and thyme. The aromatic herbs would disguise the smell long enough to make a sale. It was a gamble with her reputation, but reputation meant little if her children starved. This moral compromise was just one of countless ethical dilemmas that vendors faced daily. The line between survival and deception blurred when every unsold item meant another hungry night for the family. Thomas the bread seller regularly mixed sawdust into his flour during lean times, while Mary, the alewife, watered down her brew until it was barely recognizable as the hearty beverage it once was. These weren't the actions of inherently dishonest people, but rather the desperate measures of those trapped in an economic system that offered no safety net for failure. The physical toll of vendor life extended far beyond the obvious hardships of weather exposure and heavy lifting. The constant stress of financial uncertainty manifested in ways that medieval people could observe but not fully understand. Vendors aged rapidly, their faces etched with worry lines that spoke of countless sleepless nights spent calculating whether tomorrow's sales would cover the rent. Hair turned gray prematurely, teeth fell out from poor nutrition, and hands became GNL'd from repetitive motions and exposure to harsh elements. Margaret, the wool merchant, developed a persistent cough that racked her thin frame each winter, a condition that modern medicine would recognize as chronic bronchitis, brought on by years of breathing in wool fibers and working in damp, poorly ventilated spaces. But in medieval times, such ailments were simply accepted as the inevitable consequence of one's station in life. There were no workers' compensation laws, no understanding of occupational health hazards, and certainly no retirement plans for those whose bodies could no longer sustain the demands of street vending. The psychological pressure was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. Vendors lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, always watching for potential threats to their livelihood. A new vendor setting up nearby could spell disaster for established merchants. Changes in local laws or taxation could overnight transform a marginally profitable business into a guaranteed loss. The arrival of traveling merchants with superior goods could devastate local vendors who had spent years building their customer base. This chronic stress created a community of people who were simultaneously deeply interconnected and intensely competitive. Vendors would band together against external threats like aggressive tax collectors or hostile guild members, but would ruthlessly undercut each other when survival was at stake. Friendships formed over shared hardships could dissolve instantly when one vendor's success came at another's expense. The children of vendors inherited not just their parents' trades, but also their anxieties and survival strategies. Young ones learned to lie convincingly about the quality of goods, to spot potential troublemakers from across the marketplace, and to calculate profit margins before they could properly read or write. Childhood, as we understand it, was a luxury that vendor families could not afford. Children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to contribute meaningfully to the family's survival, whether through begging, pickpocketing, or assisting with sales. Little Emma, daughter of a candle maker, spent her days dipping wicks into tallow while her fingers grew raw from the hot wax. She dreamed of the warm bread she smelled from the baker's stall each morning, but knew that such luxuries were reserved for their customers, not for vendor families who lived perpetually on the edge of destitution. Her education consisted of learning which customers paid promptly and which required aggressive collection tactics, knowledge that would serve her well when she inevitably inherited her parents' precarious trade. The seasonal nature of many vendor businesses created additional layers of uncertainty. Summer might bring relative prosperity for those selling fresh produce or cold drinks, but winter could be devastating for vendors whose goods were less essential. Ice vendors faced months of unemployment, while those selling warm food might thrive during cold weather, but struggled during summer months when appetites diminished and food spoiled more quickly. This seasonal uncertainty forced vendors to develop complex survival strategies that required them to think and plan like modern financial advisors. Despite having no formal education in such matters, they learned to hoard coins during good months, to diversify their offerings based on seasonal demand, and to maintain multiple income streams to weather inevitable downturns. A successful vendor might sell fruit in summer, roasted chestnuts in winter, and provide odd jobs during slow periods. The lack of reliable storage facilities created additional challenges that modern vendors couldn't imagine. Without refrigeration, vendors selling perishable goods lived in constant fear of spoilage. They developed intimate knowledge of their products' shelf life, learning to detect the earliest signs of deterioration that might not be apparent to customers. This expertise, born of necessity, made them inadvertent food scientists who understood preservation and spoilage in ways that wouldn't be formally codified for centuries. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval street vendors developed a remarkable resilience that allowed them to find moments of joy and community even within their harsh circumstances. Markets became social hubs where vendors shared information about successful sales techniques, warned each other about problematic customers, and provided emotional support during particularly difficult periods. These informal networks created a form of social insurance that helped vendors survive individual crisis. The vendor community developed its own folklore and traditions that helped them cope with their difficult lives. Stories of vendors who had overcome impossible odds provided inspiration during dark times, while shared rituals and celebrations created bonds that transcended individual competition. Market day festivals, though modest affairs, offered brief respites from the grinding routine of survival and reminded vendors that they were part of a larger human community. Their resilience was perhaps most evident in their ability to maintain hope for future generations. Despite knowing firsthand the hardships of vendor life, parents continued to train their children in the trade, believing that the skills and knowledge they passed down would somehow lead to better opportunities. This optimism in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary speaks to the fundamental human capacity for hope and the deep love that parents felt for their children even when they had little material wealth to offer them. The legacy of these medieval street vendors extends far beyond their immediate historical context. Their struggles and adaptations laid the groundwork for modern commercial practices, labor rights, and social safety nets that we now take for granted. Their stories remind us that commerce, at its most basic level, is about human survival and the lengths to which people will go to provide for their families. In understanding their harsh lives, we gain perspective on our own commercial relationships and the privileges we enjoy in our modern economy. As we reflect on the lives of these forgotten entrepreneurs, we're reminded that behind every transaction, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, lies a human story of struggle, determination, and hope. The medieval street vendors who called out their wares in marketplaces across Europe were not just selling goods. They were fighting for survival, dignity, and the chance to build something better for the next generation. Medieval street vendors lived under the crushing weight of an unforgiving economic system that seemed designed to break their spirits. By the time our story reaches this point, we have witnessed their daily battles with poverty, violence, and disease. But perhaps the most insidious enemy they faced was the very foundation of their society itself, a rigid, feudal structure that trapped them in cycles of exploitation with no hope of escape. The guild system, which dominated medieval commerce, created an almost impenetrable barrier between street vendors and legitimate prosperity. These powerful organizations controlled every aspect of trade, from the quality of goods to the prices they could command. To become a guild member required not just skill, but substantial fees, political connections, and often family lineage stretching back generations. For a street vendor scraping together copper coins just to buy tomorrow's wares, such membership remained as distant as the stars. Master craftsmen jealously guarded their secrets and territories. A vendor selling bread near a guild bakery might find themselves accused of unfair competition or selling inferior goods. The penalties were swift and merciless: confiscation of goods, heavy fines, or even banishment from the marketplace. Thomas the baker, whom we met earlier struggling with his stale loaves, discovered this harsh reality when guild inspectors found sawdust mixed into his flour. The fine alone cost him 3 months of earnings, money he simply didn't have. Beyond the guilds lay an even more suffocating web of taxation and tribute. Medieval street vendors faced a bewildering array of fees and levies that seemed to multiply like weeds after rain. There was the market toll for the right to sell in the town square, the bridge tax for crossing into better neighborhoods, the cart fee for using wheeled transport, and countless other charges that local officials invented with creative enthusiasm. Consider the plight of Margaret, a widow who sold herbs and remedies from a small basket. Each morning she paid the market sergeant for her spot near the church steps. If she moved to follow the crowds, she owed additional fees to different ward officials. When she purchased her herbs from rural farmers, she paid a gate tax entering the city. If she stored any goods overnight, there was a storage fee to the warehouse keeper. By the time she calculated all these costs, her profit margin had shrunk to almost nothing. The arbitrary nature of these taxes made planning impossible. A vendor might arrive at market to find new fees imposed overnight, or discover that yesterday's legal selling spot was now forbidden territory. Officials changed rules on whims, often targeting vendors who appear to be doing well. Success itself became dangerous as prosperity attracted the attention of tax collectors, like carrying birds to a corpse. Local authorities wielded their power with capricious cruelty. The market bailiff might demand bribes to overlook minor infractions, while the town watch extorted protection money from vendors working after dark. Those who couldn't pay found their goods mysteriously confiscated or their permit suddenly revoked. Justice existed only for those who could afford to purchase it, leaving street vendors vulnerable to every petty official with a grudge or empty purse. The church, despite its teachings of charity and compassion, proved equally rapacious in its demands. Vendors were expected to contribute to religious festivals, pay for special masses, and support the local clergy's various projects. Failure to demonstrate proper piety through generous donations could result in accusations of heresy or moral corruption. In an age when religious suspicion could destroy lives, vendors had little choice but to empty their meager savings into church coffers. Even the physical marketplace itself conspired against their success. The best-selling spots near the cathedral doors, close to the main thoroughfares or under-covered porticos, were reserved for established merchants who paid premium fees. Street vendors were relegated to muddy corners, narrow alleys, or exposed areas where weather could destroy their goods, and customers rarely ventured. These prime locations weren't just about convenience, they were about survival. This uncertainty made it nearly impossible to plan ahead or invest in business growth. Social prejudice compounded these economic hardships. Street vendors occupied one of the lowest rungs of medieval society. Viewed with suspicion and contempt by their social superiors, they were seen as barely above beggars, their profession associated with trickery, desperation, and moral corruption. This reputation made it harder to attract customers, secure credit, or gain the respect necessary for business partnerships. The constant struggle for survival created a culture of desperate competition among vendors themselves. Rather than banding together against their common oppressors, they often turned on each other, undercutting prices, spreading rumors about competitors' goods, or fighting over the best-selling spots. This infighting weakened their collective bargaining power and made them easier targets for exploitation by authorities and guilds. Credit was virtually impossible to obtain at reasonable rates. Moneylenders charged crushing interest that could trap vendors in cycles of debt lasting generations. A vendor who borrowed money to purchase goods during lean times might find themselves paying back triple the original amount if they could pay it back at all. Default meant losing everything: goods, tools, and often their homes. The lack of banking institutions or commercial insurance meant that every transaction carried enormous risk. Vendors had no way to protect themselves against theft, natural disasters, or economic downturns. A single bad day could wipe out weeks of careful saving, while a string of misfortunes could destroy families that had spent generations building their small businesses. Female vendors faced additional challenges in this male-dominated society. Women were often prohibited from certain types of trade, charged higher fees for market privileges, or subjected to harassment that their male counterparts avoided. A vendor selling near the cathedral could catch parishioners before and after services when their hearts were open and their purses accessible. Those forced to the market's periphery might wait entire days without a single customer, watching their perishable goods spoil while established merchants counted their profits. The seasonal nature of street vending added another layer of uncertainty to an already precarious existence. Summer brought opportunities to sell fresh produce, cold drinks, and festival goods. But it also brought competition from rural farmers, flooding the markets with their harvests. Winter reduced both supply and demand as customers huddled indoors and goods became scarce. Vendors had to survive months of reduced income while still paying the same fees and taxes. Weather posed constant threats that no amount of planning could fully mitigate. A sudden storm could destroy a day's inventory, while extended periods of rain kept customers away and ruined stored goods. Snow blocked roads, preventing vendors from reaching suppliers or customers. During the harshest winters, some vendors froze to death in their stalls, found clutching the goods they could never afford to abandon. The legal system offered no protection for vendors wronged by customers or competitors. Courts favored those with money and status, leaving street vendors with little recourse when cheated. A nobleman who took goods without payment couldn't be challenged by a mere vendor. Fellow vendors might steal each other's customers through undercutting or spreading malicious rumors, but formal complaints required resources that few possessed. Contract enforcement was nearly impossible for small vendors. Agreements with suppliers often relied on trust and handshakes, leaving vendors vulnerable when deliveries failed to arrive or goods proved defective. Without written contracts or legal representation, vendors had no way to recover losses or hold partners accountable. Widows trying to continue their husbands' businesses found themselves excluded from supplier networks or forced to work through male intermediaries who took substantial cuts of their profits. The guild system's grip on skilled trades meant that street vendors were largely confined to selling basic necessities or second-hand goods. They couldn't compete with guild-protected craftsmen in quality or prestige, forcing them to focus on volume and low prices. This created a vicious cycle where they had to work harder for smaller margins, making it even more difficult to accumulate the capital needed to improve their circumstances. Innovation was not just discouraged, but actively suppressed. A vendor who developed a new product or improved technique might find themselves accused of violating guild privileges or traditional practices. Authorities preferred the predictable tax revenue from established systems over the uncertainty that innovation might bring. This stagnation ensured that vendors remained trapped in the same basic survival strategies for generations. Transportation costs ate into profits with relentless efficiency. Vendors who traveled between markets faced tolls at bridges, city gates, and territorial boundaries. Those who remained in one location missed opportunities to find better prices for their goods or access to different customer bases. Either choice carried significant financial penalties that successful merchants could absorb, but street vendors could not. The feudal system's emphasis on personal loyalty and obligation, rather than commercial law, created additional complications for vendors. They might be forced to provide free goods or services to local lords, participate in military campaigns, or contribute labor to public works projects. These obligations, while supposedly mutual, were rarely reciprocated with meaningful protection or assistance. Even success carried its own dangers. A vendor who managed to accumulate modest wealth might find themselves targeted for robbery, extortion, or trumped-up legal charges designed to separate them from their money. Authorities often viewed prosperous vendors as sources of revenue rather than contributors to the local economy, increasing pressure and scrutiny as profits grew. The psychological toll of this constant economic pressure cannot be understated. Vendors lived in perpetual anxiety, never knowing when the next crisis would strike or whether they could survive it. This stress affected their health, their family relationships, and their ability to make sound business decisions. Many turned to alcohol or other escapes, further undermining their chances of success. Despite these overwhelming challenges, some vendors managed to carve out small niches of relative stability. They formed informal networks of mutual support, shared information about market conditions, and helped each other during emergencies. These relationships, built on trust and shared hardship, provided the only reliable safety net available to them. The most successful vendors learned to navigate the complex web of regulations and relationships that governed their world. They cultivated connections with sympathetic officials, found ways to provide value to guild members without directly competing, and developed reputations for honesty that attracted loyal customers. But these strategies required years to develop and could be destroyed by a single misstep or change in local politics. Religious festivals and market fairs provided occasional opportunities for exceptional profits, but they also brought increased competition and higher fees. Vendors had to balance the potential rewards against the costs of preparation, travel, and premium market charges. Many gambled their entire savings on these events, hoping for windfall profits that might carry them through leaner times. The seasonal migration of vendors following harvests, festivals, and trade routes created its own set of challenges. Constant travel was expensive and dangerous, but staying in one location often meant accepting lower profits and limited opportunities. Vendors had to choose between the security of familiar markets and the potential rewards of exploring new territories. As we witness these vendors struggling against systematic oppression, we begin to understand how their daily battles shaped not just their own lives, but the entire fabric of medieval society. Their persistence in the face of such overwhelming obstacles speaks to a resilience that bordered on the heroic. Tomorrow we will see how some of these vendors fought back against the forces arrayed against them, and how their small acts of defiance helped plant the seeds of economic change that would eventually transform the medieval world. Medieval street vendors operated in a precarious world where survival depended not only on selling their meager wares, but on navigating an intricate web of social hierarchies, guild politics, and ever-changing regulations. While we've explored their struggles with poverty, disease, and violence, there's another layer to their hardship that reveals the true complexity of their existence: the psychological toll of living perpetually on society's margins. The mental burden these vendors carried was perhaps their heaviest load. Imagine waking each morning knowing that your very presence in the marketplace was barely tolerated. Street vendors existed in a legal gray area, neither fully accepted nor completely banned. They were the economic untouchables, performing necessary functions while being scorned by the very people who relied on their services. This psychological stress manifested in various ways throughout their daily lives. Many vendors developed a characteristic hunched posture, not just from carrying heavy loads, but from the constant need to appear smaller, less threatening to guild members and authorities who might view their presence as competition or disruption. They learned to read the subtle signs of approaching trouble, the way a guild enforcer's hand moved toward his purse to count bribes, or how quickly a crowd's mood could turn hostile when times were lean. The constant vigilance required was exhausting. A successful vendor needed to maintain awareness of multiple threats simultaneously: pickpockets eyeing their small profits, competitors seeking to undercut their prices, authorities looking for excuses to levy fines, and customers who might accuse them of shortchanging or selling inferior goods. This hypervigilance often led to a form of chronic anxiety that permeated every aspect of their existence. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and brief. Many vendors rose before dawn to secure the best spots, and those who sold prepared foods often worked late into the evening to prepare for the next day. The precious few hours of rest were frequently interrupted by nightmares about losing their stock to thieves or being permanently banished from their selling locations. The social isolation was perhaps even more damaging than the physical hardships. Street vendors were caught between worlds, too poor to associate with established merchants, yet their commercial activities separated them from the common laborers and artisans who made up their customer base. They were neither fully part of the merchant class nor completely accepted by the working poor. This liminal existence created a profound sense of not belonging anywhere. Family relationships suffered under these pressures. Vendor families were often forced to scatter during working hours, with children sent to beg or perform small services while parents manned their stalls. The constant stress of economic uncertainty created tension within households. Arguments over spending priorities were common. Should they invest in better goods that might attract more customers or save every penny for the inevitable lean periods? Women vendors faced additional psychological burdens beyond the general challenges of street selling. They had to navigate the particular vulnerabilities of being female in public spaces. They developed complex strategies for dealing with harassment, from positioning themselves near protective landmarks to forming informal alliances with other vendors who could provide assistance if needed. Many carried themselves with a defensive posture that became second nature, always ready to deflect unwanted attention while still appearing approachable to potential customers. The relationship between street vendors and established guild merchants was particularly psychologically complex. Vendors often harbored deep resentment toward guild members who seemed to live in luxury while vendors scrambled for survival. Yet this resentment was mixed with envy and aspiration. Many vendors dreamed of somehow earning enough to buy their way into a guild. Though such social mobility was extremely rare, this psychological tension was evident in the way vendors interacted with guild merchants' customers. They had to appear respectful and differential to people they often viewed as undeservedly privileged, while simultaneously trying to convince these same people to purchase from them rather than from established shops. The cognitive dissonance of this daily performance took its toll. Religious faith provided some psychological relief, but it was complicated by the church's often contradictory messages. While Christianity preached about the dignity of honest labor and charity toward the poor, the reality was that street vendors were often viewed as morally suspect. The church's emphasis on fixed social hierarchies suggested that vendors' low status was divinely ordained, creating additional psychological conflict for those struggling to improve their circumstances. Some vendors found solace in developing their own informal spiritual practices. They might carry small religious tokens or develop personal rituals around their work, blessing their goods at the start of each day, or offering silent prayers for protection and prosperity. These practices provided a sense of agency and hope in otherwise powerless circumstances. The psychological impact of constant uncertainty cannot be overstated. Unlike artisans or laborers who might have some predictability in their work and income, street vendors lived in a state of perpetual instability. Weather, political upheavals, religious festivals, market regulations, seasonal fluctuations, and countless other factors could dramatically affect their earnings from day to day. This uncertainty made long-term planning nearly impossible and created a perpetual state of anxiety about the future. Many vendors developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and depression. Contemporary accounts describe vendors who became increasingly withdrawn, suspicious of others, and prone to sudden outbursts of anger or despair. The constant struggle for survival left little mental energy for joy, creativity, or personal growth. The children of street vendors were particularly affected by these psychological pressures. Growing up in an environment of constant stress and uncertainty, they often developed premature maturity and anxiety. Many learned to suppress their own needs and desires to avoid adding to their family's burdens. The psychological patterns established in childhood often perpetuated the cycle of marginal existence into the next generation. Despite these immense psychological challenges, many vendors developed remarkable resilience and adaptive strategies. They created informal support networks, sharing information about market conditions, warning each other about threats, and sometimes pooling resources during particularly difficult periods. These relationships, forged in shared hardship, often became sources of genuine emotional support and community. Some vendors found ways to maintain dignity and self-respect despite their marginal status. They might specialize in particular goods or develop reputations for honesty and fair dealing that gave them pride in their work. Others used humor as a coping mechanism, developing wit and storytelling skills that entertained customers while also providing psychological release from daily stresses. The psychological toll of medieval street vending extended beyond individual suffering to impact entire communities. The presence of large numbers of psychologically stressed, economically desperate people created undercurrents of social tension that could erupt during times of crisis. Food riots, anti-establishment uprisings, and religious movements often found fertile ground among populations that included many marginal vendors and traders. Yet, perhaps most remarkably, many of these vendors maintained hope despite their circumstances. They continued to believe that hard work, cleverness, and persistence might eventually improve their situations. This hope, however fragile, was essential to their psychological survival and represents one of the most admirable aspects of their resilience. The legacy of their psychological struggles reminds us that economic marginality has always been about more than material deprivation. The mental and emotional costs of living on society's edges, the stress, isolation, uncertainty, and loss of dignity were perhaps the heaviest burdens these medieval street vendors had to bear. Their stories illuminate the full human cost of economic inequality and social exclusion. Lessons that remain relevant in understanding marginalized communities throughout history and into our present day. Part 10. The brutal realities of earning a living on the streets. As dawn broke over the crowded medieval marketplace, the street vendors stirred from whatever meager shelter they had managed to secure for the night. Perhaps it was a doorway shared with rats and refuse, or a corner beneath a merchant stall where the wind cut less sharply through their threadbare cloaks. For these forgotten souls, each new day brought the same relentless struggle, to earn enough copper coins to survive another 24 hours in a world that seemed designed to crush them. The hierarchy of street commerce was as rigid and unforgiving as any feudal system. At the top sat the established guild merchants with their stone shops and royal charters, their coffers heavy with silver, and their bellies round with plenty. Below them came the licensed traders who paid hefty fees for the privilege of setting up permanent stalls in the better sections of the market square. But at the very bottom, scraping by in the shadows and margins, were the unlicensed street vendors, men, women, and children who hawked whatever they could find, make, or steal, just to put a crust of bread in their mouths. These desperate souls faced persecution from every direction. The guild merchants despised them as unfair competition who undercut their prices with inferior goods. The licensed traders saw them as parasites who attracted the wrong sort of customer and drove away respectable buyers. The city authorities viewed them as a nuisance at best and criminals at worst, subject to arbitrary fines, confiscation of goods, and violent expulsion from prime-milling locations. Margaret the ragwoman understood this brutal reality better than most. For 15 years, she had wandered the narrow streets of London with a canvas sack slung over her bent shoulders, calling out in a voice made by decades of shouting, "Rags! Old clothes! Good coin for your cast-offs!" Her weathered hands, permanently stained black from handling countless dirty garments, would sort through the discarded clothing of the wealthy, searching for items that could be cleaned, mended, and resold to those slightly less desperate than herself. The work was backbreaking and humiliating. Margaret would spend hours bent over rain barrels, scrubbing blood, vomit, and worse, from garments that had been worn by plague victims, executed criminals, or simply the unwashed masses. The stench clung to her like a second skin, marking her as untouchable in a society already stratified by smell. Respectable citizens would cross the street to avoid her, covering their noses with perfumed handkerchiefs, as if her very presence might contaminate them. But even this degrading labor was fraught with competition and danger. Other rag women would fight viciously over the contents of a promising midden heap, clawing and biting each other for the chance to claim a moth-eaten tunic or a pair of shoes with holes worn through the soles. Margaret bore the scars of dozens of such encounters. A missing tooth from when Agnes the shrew had struck her with a wooden club, a permanent limp from the time she had been pushed down a flight of stone steps while fleeing with an armload of stolen rags. The authorities showed no mercy to those caught in such disputes. When the watch discovered two rag women fighting over a pile of discarded clothing, their solution was typically to confiscate everything, throw both women in the stocks for a day and night, and warn them that repeat offenses would result in branding or exile. There was no appeal, no consideration of circumstance, no recognition that these women were fighting for their very survival. For those vendors who managed to accumulate a small stock of goods to sell, the daily routine was one of constant vigilance and crushing anxiety. They had to rise before dawn to claim the best spots, usually the areas where foot traffic was heaviest, but where guild merchants and licensed traders had not yet established dominance. This meant positioning themselves near the entrances to churches, just as morning prayers were ending, or at crossroads where country folk entered the city with their carts of produce. But even securing a prime location was only the beginning of the day's challenges. Street vendors had to be prepared to flee at a moment's notice when guild enforcers or city officials made their rounds. The lucky ones might receive a few minutes' warning from sympathetic passers-by or fellow vendors who had spotted the approaching authorities. The unlucky ones would find their meager wares scattered in the mud, trampled by the boots of men who derived genuine pleasure from destroying the livelihood of those too poor to fight back. Old Henrik the pie seller had perfected the art of rapid retreat. His wooden cart was fitted with leather straps that allowed him to sling it across his back like a massive pack, transforming him from stationary vendor to fleeing refugee in a matter of seconds. He had memorized every alley, every hidden courtyard, every loose board in every fence that might provide escape routes when the authorities came calling. His meat pies, if the gray, gristly filling could truly be called meat, were barely edible. But Henrik had survived in the trade for over 2 decades through sheer cunning and an intimate knowledge of urban geography. The constant stress of this cat-and-mouse existence took a terrible toll on the vendor's physical and mental health. Many developed nervous twitches, constantly scanning the crowds for signs of approaching trouble. Others became paranoid and suspicious, viewing every customer as a potential informant and every fellow vendor as competition to be eliminated. The lucky ones simply grew numb to the daily humiliations. Their spirits crushed into a state of dull acceptance that allowed them to endure but never truly live. Sleep was a luxury that few street vendors could afford. Those without family or friends to provide shelter would spend their nights huddled in doorways, under bridges, or in the ruins of abandoned buildings. They slept in shifts when possible, taking turns to watch for thieves, rapists, or simply other desperate souls who might kill them for their few possessions. The winter months were particularly brutal, with frostbite claiming fingers and toes, and pneumonia cutting down the weak and elderly with merciless efficiency. Even those fortunate enough to have some form of shelter faced constant uncertainty. Landlords who rented space to the destitute charged exorbitant rates for HVACs that respectable people wouldn't house their animals in. A single room might be shared by a dozen or more people, with straw pallets rotated in shifts so that bodies were always occupying every available space. Privacy was non-existent. Sanitation was primitive at best, and disease spread through these cramped quarters like wildfire. Young Thomas the apple boy had learned these harsh lessons at the tender age of 7 when his father died of the sweating sickness, and his mother was forced to send him into the streets to earn what he could. The boy would station himself near the cathedral steps with a small basket of bruised apples purchased from farmers who couldn't sell their damaged goods to more reputable buyers. His piping voice calling sweet apples fresh from the orchard was a lie that everyone understood, but few questioned. The apples were neither sweet nor fresh. but they were cheap. And in a world where hunger was a constant companion, even bruised fruit could find buyers. Thomas quickly learned that success in the street vending trade had little to do with the quality of one's goods and everything to do with reading people in situations. He could spot a potential customer from 50 paces. The way they walked, the cut of their clothes, the expression on their faces, all provided clues about their likelihood to purchase and their ability to pay. More importantly, he learned to recognize the various types of danger that stalk the streets. The guild enforcers with their leather jerkins and oak cudgels, the city watch with their distinctive steel caps and officious manner, the older street children who might try to steal his basket and his earnings. The boy also discovered that pity could be a powerful sales tool. His naturally small stature and undernourished appearance made him appear even younger than his years, and many customers would purchase his inferior apples simply because they felt sorry for him. Thomas learned to emphasize his poverty and vulnerability, affecting a slight limp and speaking in a voice made thin by genuine hunger. It was a degrading performance, but it meant the difference between eating and going hungry. But even pity had its limits. When times were particularly hard and food scarce, competition among child vendors became vicious. Thomas bore scars from encounters with other desperate children who had tried to steal his selling spot or his meager earnings. A broken nose from 8-year-old Sarah, the bread girl who had struck him with a stone when he refused to surrender his place near the church door. A jagged scar on his forearm from where 12-year-old Will the pie boy had slashed him with a rusty knife during a dispute over a dropped penny. The adult vendors offered little protection or solidarity to these child competitors. If anything, many resented the children for their ability to generate sympathy and their willingness to work for smaller profits. An adult vendor might need to earn 6p to afford a night's lodging and a bowl of thin stew, while a child could survive on 2p worth of stale bread and a corner to sleep in. This economic reality created bitter divisions within an already marginalized community, turning potential allies against each other in a desperate struggle for survival. The authorities exploited these divisions ruthlessly. City officials would offer small rewards to vendors who informed on their competitors. A few copper coins for reporting unlicensed trading, a bowl of soup for identifying stolen goods, a night in a warm cell instead of the stocks for providing information about planned gatherings or protests. These tactics created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and betrayal that made organized resistance nearly impossible. Yet even in this harsh environment, moments of genuine human kindness occasionally flickered like candle flames in the darkness. When old Henrik collapsed from exhaustion during a particularly brutal summer heat wave, it was his fellow vendors who carried him to shade and shared their precious water with him. When young Thomas was beaten and robbed by a gang of older boys, Margaret the rag woman used her own meager earnings to buy him bread and tend his wounds. These acts of compassion were rare and small, but they represented the stubborn persistence of human decency in circumstances designed to crush it. The vendors also developed their own informal codes of conduct and mutual protection. Certain selling spots were understood to belong to specific individuals, and while these territorial claims had no legal standing, they were generally respected by the vendor community. Information about the movements of authorities was shared freely, with elaborate systems of signals and warnings that could clear an entire street of unlicensed traders in a matter of minutes. When one vendor was arrested or expelled, others might pool their resources to help their family survive until they could return or find alternative means of support. These networks of mutual aid were fragile and constantly tested by the pressure of survival. Trust was a luxury that few could afford, and betrayal was always a temptation when the alternative was starvation. But they persisted nonetheless, representing perhaps the only form of social organization available to those excluded from guilds, churches, and other formal institutions of medieval society. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created additional challenges for street vendors. Summer brought opportunities for increased trade as people spent more time outdoors and farmers brought fresh produce to market. But it also brought competition from country folk who could undercut urban vendors with genuinely fresh goods. Autumn was a time of preparation as vendors scrambled to accumulate warm clothing and preserved foods for the coming winter. Winter itself was a time of endurance when only the hardiest and most resourceful could continue trading, while many others simply tried to survive until spring. Spring brought renewal, but also desperation, as vendors who had barely survived the winter emerged weakened and depleted, facing fierce competition for the renewed opportunities of the warmer months. The cycle was relentless and unforgiving, with each season bringing its own particular hardships and challenges. Through all of this, the street vendors maintained their humanity through stories, songs, and shared memories. In the brief moments when they could gather safely, they would tell tales of better times, sing folk songs that reminded them of their humanity, and share gossip and information that helped them navigate their dangerous world. These oral traditions serve not only as entertainment, but as a form of cultural resistance, preserving values of dignity, community, and hope in circumstances designed to destroy them. The street vendors of medieval times were more than mere economic actors struggling to survive in a harsh marketplace. They were human beings who had been pushed to the very margins of society, but who refused to surrender their humanity entirely. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, people find ways to maintain dignity, to care for one another, and to resist the forces that would reduce them to mere objects of exploitation. Their lives were indeed harsh beyond modern comprehension, but they were also marked by moments of courage, kindness, and stubborn persistence that speak to the enduring strength of the human spirit. In remembering their struggles, we honor not only their memory, but also our shared humanity and our obligation to create a world where such desperate circumstances are no longer necessary for survival. Word count 2,256. Here is part 11 of the harsh lives of medieval street vendors. For all their struggles with corrupt officials and economic hardship, medieval street vendors faced perhaps their greatest challenge in the form of disease and medical crisis that could devastate their already precarious livelihoods. In an age before modern medicine, even a minor illness could spell financial ruin for a vendor who depended on daily sales to survive. The bubonic plague, which swept through Europe repeatedly during the medieval period, represented the ultimate catastrophe for street vendors. When plague struck a city, trade ground to a halt almost overnight. Markets were abandoned, customers fled or died, and vendors who had invested their meager savings in perishable goods watched helplessly as their inventory rotted unsold. Those vendors who survived the initial outbreak often found themselves in communities where half the population had perished, leaving far fewer customers with money to spend. Beyond the Great Plagues, everyday illnesses posed constant threats to vendors' survival. A baker who broke his arm could not knead dough. A fishmonger with dysentery could not travel to the docks. A cloth seller whose eyes failed from years of working by candlelight might lose the ability to distinguish quality fabrics. Unlike guild craftsmen who often had apprentices or family members to assist them, street vendors typically worked alone and had no safety net when illness struck. The unsanitary conditions of medieval cities made disease transmission inevitable for street vendors. They worked in close proximity to open sewers, rotting refuse, and contaminated water sources. Food vendors were particularly vulnerable as they handled products that attracted rats, flies, and other disease vectors. The same crowded market conditions that were essential for generating sales also created perfect breeding grounds for contagion. Medieval medical knowledge offered little hope for sick vendors. Most could not afford the services of trained physicians who primarily served the wealthy. Instead, they relied on folk remedies, herbal treatments from local wise women, or the dubious ministrations of traveling charlatans who peddled miracle cures. Many vendors attempted to treat themselves with whatever ingredients they could afford, often with disastrous results. When vendors fell seriously ill, their families faced impossible choices. Should they continue operating the business despite the risk of spreading disease to customers? Should they close temporarily and lose vital income? Should they sell their remaining inventory at desperate prices to pay for treatment? These decisions often determined whether a vendor family would survive or join the ranks of the destitute beggars who haunted medieval streets. The psychological toll of constant exposure to death and disease weighed heavily on medieval street vendors. They witnessed the suffering of their customers, their neighbors, and their competitors on a daily basis. Funeral processions were a regular sight in medieval cities, and vendors often found themselves selling goods to families preparing to bury their loved ones. This constant reminder of mortality created an atmosphere of anxiety and desperation that permeated the vendor community. Some vendors developed superstitious practices in attempts to ward off disease. They might wear amulets, recite prayers over their merchandise, or refuse to serve customers who appeared sickly. Others turned to alcohol as a means of coping with stress and fear, though this often led to additional problems with judgment and financial management. The economic impact of disease extended far beyond individual illness. When plague or other epidemics struck, entire supply chains collapsed. Farmers stopped bringing produce to market, craftsmen ceased production, and trade routes were abandoned. Vendors who had built relationships with reliable suppliers suddenly found themselves unable to obtain goods to sell. Those who had extended credit to customers often discovered that their debtors had died, taking any hope of repayment with them. Disease also disrupted the informal networks that vendors depended upon for survival. When illness struck, the cooperative arrangements between vendors often broke down. A vendor who had agreed to watch a neighbor's stall might flee the city to escape contagion. Suppliers who had provided goods on credit might demand immediate payment out of fear that their customers would not survive to pay later. The social bonds that held the vendor community together frequently dissolved under the pressure of epidemic disease. Children of vendor families were particularly vulnerable to the health crisis that plagued medieval cities. High infant mortality rates meant that many vendor families lost multiple children before they reached adulthood. Those children who survived often suffered from malnutrition and stunted growth, making them less capable of contributing to the family business. Parents faced the heartbreaking choice between feeding their children adequately and maintaining enough capital to keep their businesses operating. The few medical resources available to vendors were often more dangerous than helpful. Bloodletting, the most common medical treatment of the era, frequently weakened patients who were already malnourished. Herbal remedies were sometimes effective, but just as often poisonous, especially when prepared by inexperienced practitioners. Surgery, when attempted at all, was performed without anesthesia or understanding of sterile technique, leading to high rates of infection and death. Some vendors attempted to diversify their businesses as protection against illness-related financial ruin. A cloth seller might also trade in preserved foods that would keep if he became too sick to work for several days. A baker might teach his wife and children his trade so they could continue operating if he fell ill. However, these strategies were limited by the small scale of most vendor operations and the lack of capital needed to maintain multiple product lines. Religious beliefs provided some comfort to vendors facing the constant threat of disease, but also created additional burdens. Many believed that illness was punishment for sin, leading to feelings of guilt and shame. Others spent precious resources on religious offerings and pilgrimages in hopes of divine protection. The Church's teachings about accepting suffering as God's will sometimes discouraged vendors from seeking medical treatment or taking preventive measures. The vulnerability of street vendors to disease had lasting effects on medieval urban society. The frequent deaths of vendors disrupted local food distribution systems and contributed to periodic shortages of essential goods. The constant turnover in the vendor population prevented the development of stable commercial relationships and hindered the growth of more sophisticated trade networks. The fear of contagion also reinforced social prejudices against vendors who were often blamed for spreading disease through their mobility and contact with diverse populations. Despite these overwhelming challenges, some medieval street vendors displayed remarkable resilience in the face of health crisis. They developed practical strategies for minimizing exposure to disease, such as avoiding certain areas of the city during outbreaks or trading only with trusted customers. They formed mutual aid societies that provided basic care for sick members and support for the families of those who died. They adapted their business practices to changing circumstances, shifting to products that were less perishable or more in demand during times of crisis. The experience of disease and medical crisis among medieval street vendors reveals the extreme fragility of life at the margins of medieval society. These men and women lived constantly on the edge of catastrophe, where a single illness could destroy years of careful planning and hard work. Their struggles illuminate the harsh realities of urban life in an age when medical knowledge was primitive and social safety nets virtually non-existent. Yet their persistence in the face of such overwhelming odds testifies to the fundamental human drive to survive and provide for one's family even under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. Part 12. The Enduring Legacy. Despite the crushing hardships that defined their existence, the medieval street vendors of Scotland and across Europe left an indelible mark on history. Their story is not merely one of suffering, but of profound human resilience that shaped the very foundations of our modern world. These forgotten merchants who hawked their meager wares through muddy streets and crowded marketplaces were unwitting pioneers of commerce. Without formal education or powerful patrons, they created the earliest networks of trade that would eventually evolve into the sophisticated market systems we know today. Their crude stalls and desperate bartering laid the groundwork for merchant guilds, banking systems, and international trade routes. The street vendor's legacy lives on in the bustling markets found in cities worldwide. From London's Borough Market to Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, the spirit of those medieval traders echoes through time. Their descendants learned to organize, to demand fair treatment, and to claim their rightful place in society's economic structure. Perhaps most remarkably, these vendors embodied an entrepreneurial spirit that refused to be extinguished by poverty or persecution. In an age when most people were bound to the land or locked into hereditary trades, street vendors chose mobility and independence over security. They risked everything for the chance to better their circumstances, teaching us that commerce and ambition can flourish even in the darkest times. Their story reminds us that behind every statistic of medieval poverty were real people with hopes, dreams, and an unshakable determination to survive. In honoring their memory, we celebrate not just their struggles, but their triumph over seemingly impossible odds.